Russia has spent 4 years choosing which Ukrainian power substation to destroy next, rarely the one easiest to reach. Those look very similar to many others, some of which are closer to the border and easier to hit. DTEK executive Dmytro Sakharuk said of the real targets within months of the invasion. On December 13, 2025, roughly 500 Russian missiles and drones hit the power grid nationwide in a single night. Odesa hit hardest, leaving more than 1 million people without electricity, part of a campaign that had, by one estimate, already destroyed up to 85% of the country's thermal generation capacity. Every strike meant choosing this switchyard over an identical 140 kilometers, about 25 miles, away, then deciding whether to hit it again. What actually decides which node gets chosen, and why can a drone priced in the tens of thousands of dollars force a rebuild measured in a year or more? Start with the word itself. A substation is not a power plant. It is the switchyard between a power plant and the wires that reach a city. A fenced lot of steel towers, circuit breakers, and transformers that takes electricity at transmission voltage, the kind carried on the tall pylons that cross open country, and steps it down to a voltage a factory or a home can actually use. Lose the plant and a region loses its own generator. Lose the right substation instead, and a region loses its connection to every generator on the network at once, including the ones untouched and still running 100 kilometers away. The transformer is the part that does that stepping down, and it is worth knowing by name because it is also the hardest part on the site to replace. A high-voltage transformer in the larger auto transformer used at the biggest nodes is not a mass-produced part off a shelf. It is custom wound for a specific voltage and a specific grid, weighs tens to hundreds of tons, and is built to order by a small number of factories worldwide. Ukraine's grid runs on former Soviet electrical standards, which narrows the list of factories that can build a compatible replacement to former Soviet bloc countries plus, for reasons rooted in their own industrial history, Japan and South Korea. A standard high-power transformer runs on the order of $2 million. The largest auto transformers, the ones at Ukraine's biggest nodes, have run past 4 million and taken deliveries measured in months once a factory slot opens. Independent reporting on the repair effort puts that sourcing time at a year or more when no slot is available at all. The campaign against this equipment did not start as a doctrine. It started in October 2022, roughly 8 months into the full invasion, as a wave of strikes concentrated on outdoor switchyard equipment, the transformers and circuit breakers connecting individual power plants to the wider grid, rather than the plants themselves. Within that first winter, reporting at the time already described more than a third of the state grid operator Ukrenergo's substations as damaged. The campaign did not hold that shape. It shifted twice more in the years that followed, first toward the power plants directly, then back toward the transmission network with a specific strategic goal behind it, a goal built around that same transformer, which one out of thousands is worth the missile. What holds constant underneath every shift is the same mismatch. A missile or a long-range drone reaches its target in minutes and, at the low end of published estimates, costs in the tens of thousands of dollars. A destroyed auto transformer costs millions and takes months to a year to replace, if a factory slot exists at all. That asymmetry, seconds of flight time against a year of factory lead time, is the stakes of this doctrine, and it is why the choice of which specific substation to hit matters far more than the choice of which weapon to hit it with. Grid engineers build redundancy into a transmission network using a standard called N1, sometimes tightened to N2. The idea, translated out of the jargon, the network has to keep serving every customer even if any one substation, or any two, drops out entirely. Because equipment fails on its own often enough that a single point of failure cannot be allowed to black out a city. Picture a city fed by 3 separate bridges across a river. N1 means losing any one bridge still leaves two open, and traffic reroutes without anyone downtown noticing. Before the invasion, Ukraine's transmission network had roughly twice the capacity of its own generation. According to the analysis group Rusai, about 56 gigawatts of transmission built against roughly 25 gigawatts of actual generation. That gap was deliberate. It was the buffer that let operators reroute power around any single loss, the grid equivalent of building 3 bridges where the traffic only ever needs 2. That buffer is what repeat strikes on the same substation are built to consume. Hitting one node once removes one bridge, the other 2 still carry the load, and repair crews eventually restore the first. Hitting the same node again before it is repaired, and again after that, removes a second bridge and then makes the third one's failure catastrophic instead of survivable. Rusi's own assessment states plainly that this margin has been consumed over the course of the war, to the point that transmission capacity is now close to generation capacity. The number of spare bridges has fallen towards 0. This is why a substation that gets struck 5 times shows up in casualty counts as one location, but functions mechanically as 5 separate withdrawals, from a redundancy account that started with a large balance and now does not. Not every substation makes an equally useful target for this, and the difference comes down to 3 questions a planner can answer just by reading a transmission map. First, how many lines converge there? A substation at the end of a single spur, feeding one town, is a driveway, and losing its strands one neighborhood. A substation where several regional lines cross is an interchange, and losing its strands every neighborhood those lines were reaching. The ones Sakharuk pointed at, the very important ones, are the interchanges, hub nodes where damaging one site degrades several regions' worth of rerouting options at once, rather than one region's. Second, what sits downstream of it, a hub feeding ordinary households scores lower than one feeding a rail line moving munitions, a city's water pumps, or a factory the war effort depends on. Third, whether it has already been hit, a damaged node with repair crews still on site is a softer, more disruptive restrike than an untouched one, because it removes a spare path that was already thinner than it looked. The research group CSIS, in an analysis published in July 2026, describes the resulting pattern as systems-level rather than opportunistic sustained pressure on specific transmission sections, particularly the grid east of the Dnipro River and the infrastructure serving Odesa, chosen for the width of the disruption a single strike there can cause, not simply for how easy the site is to reach. Inside every one of those sites, the object worth the missile is that same transformer. The steel gantries and fencing around it are cheap and fast to rebuild. The transformer is neither, which makes it the aim point. Scaled up to the whole country, this same redundancy collapse logic is what the Institute for the Study of War has described in assessments reported in January 2026 as an attempt to split Ukraine's grid along a rough east to west line following the Dnipro, creating what the analysis calls energy islands, regions cut off not just from a damaged local substation, but from the entire rest of the network's spare capacity. A city that loses its own plant can normally still buy power from a neighboring region's surplus down the same transmission lines the N1 standard was built to keep open. Islanding is the attempt to sever those lines themselves at the scale of half the country, so that a region with intact local generation still cannot help a neighboring region that has none. At national scale, the image is a severed highway system between provinces rather than one closed bridge in one city. None of this happens by accident. Analysts who have studied the strike pattern note that hitting exactly the choke points that matter, rather than the substation's easiest to reach, points toward planning with real grid engineering knowledge behind it, quite possibly aided by Ukraine's Soviet-era grid. Built and documented by the same engineering tradition Russia inherited its own copy of. That inference is an analyst's reading of the pattern, not a confirmed intelligence finding, and it is worth holding at that level of confidence, a plausible explanation for why the targeting looks informed, not proof of how the target list gets built. One more piece of the mechanism explains a pattern that otherwise looks strange. Russia has not struck Ukraine's nuclear reactors directly, despite 3 reactor sites remaining under Ukrainian control and generating power throughout the war at Rivne, Khmelnytsky, and South Ukraine. It has instead struck the transformer substations that carry power to and from those plants. A reactor is difficult to damage meaningfully with a conventional strike without an outcome no one on either side wants to be blamed for triggering. And it sits inside international monitoring that makes a direct hit a diplomatic liability in its own right. The substation next to it carries none of that protection, and losing it can still take a plant off the grid, or in the worst case force it onto emergency backup power to keep its own safety systems running, which is exactly the scenario the International Atomic Energy Agency has repeatedly warned about. The reactor is the asset everyone is watching. The substation next to it is the one actually exposed. 4 years of documented strikes give this targeting pattern a dated sourced record. The October 2022 opening wave included a single barrage of 84 cruise missiles and 24 loitering munitions across 14 regions in one morning, aimed at switchyard equipment rather than plants. DTEK, whose staff worked through the barrage from bunkers, reported repair crew casualties mounting through that same period, and by the following February, the company said more than 140 of its own employees had been killed since the invasion began. The toll is stated once, here because it is documented and it is DTEK's own count. The doctrine it was built to enforce is the subject. The doctrine's first major shift came in the spring of 2024, when Russia pivoted from transmission equipment toward generation itself, Zmyivska thermal plant in the Kharkiv region, and the same day, Kharkiv's combined heat and power plant number 5, supplying roughly half the city's heat, both destroyed on March 22nd. 3 weeks later, Trypilska thermal plant, which had supplied roughly half of Kyiv's electricity, was hit on April 11th in an 82 missile and drone barrage that included 6 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. A strike expensive enough in munitions alone to signal how much value Russia placed on that single site. The Poland-based analysis group OSU, assessing the damage that same month, put cumulative losses as high as 85% of Ukraine's thermal generation capacity and half its hydroelectric capacity. A snapshot figure from April 2024 rather than a final or current one. If tracking how a doctrine like this gets built, mechanism by documented mechanism, across the whole drone war is useful to you, that is the premise of this channel. And following it costs nothing more than a subscription. By late 2025, the pattern shifted again, back toward transmission and the islanding logic, at a scale beyond anything in the first 2 years of the war. February 2026 alone saw roughly 288 missiles fired, more than double January's total, alongside upward of 5,000 long-range drones in that single month. A monthly combined total Ukrainian officials have called the highest since early 2023. The Institute for the Study of War, in assessments reported through July 2026, geolocated 62 separate substations, power plants, and transfer nodes struck at least once over a single 3-week stretch that month. Ukraine's own unmanned systems forces separately claimed a higher count, 136 substations struck across a comparable stretch. That second figure is a claim from a party fighting the war it describes, not an independently confirmed count. And it is stated here as exactly that. The honest complication belongs here. The Institute for the Study of War's own assessment, reported on March 4, 2026, concluded that despite all of it, Russia's winter campaign had not achieved its central technical objective. The grid was not successfully split into the isolated energy islands the strategy was aiming for. Substantial damage is not the same claim as strategic success, and the clearest evidence that Ukraine's defensive measures are working, at least partially, comes from the same institution that documented the doctrine's intent in the first place. A parallel dispute runs alongside the engineering one, and it has not been resolved either. In March 2024, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Lieutenant General Sergei Kobolash and Admiral Viktor Sokolov, citing reasonable grounds to believe both directed missile strikes against Ukrainian electrical infrastructure amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Russia, which does not recognize the court's jurisdiction, maintains the infrastructure struck consists of legitimate military and dual-use targets, feeding facilities that also serve the war effort. The United Nations Human Rights Chief has condemned the strikes directly. An arrest warrant reflects a judicial finding of reasonable grounds, not a conviction, and the dispute over whether this campaign is lawful targeting or a crime remains open in a way the engineering evidence does not. The cost math needs the same caution. A Shahed-type drone is commonly estimated at $20,000 to $50,000, a KH-101 or Kalib cruise missile at roughly $2 million. Set those figures against a transformer running $2 million and up, and the exchange looks lopsided in the attacker's favor almost regardless of which weapon is used. That comparison is offered here as a calculation, not a finding borrowed from a single source, because the missile cost figures themselves are disputed. At least one defense-focused publication has argued the commonly cited Russian missile prices may be inflated for messaging purposes on the Ukrainian and Western side, and this account is treating that dispute as unresolved rather than picking a side in it. A grid engineer, not a general, is the right person to explain what this doctrine actually is. Choke point selection. Repeat strikes that collapse the N1 buffer, islanding that severs whole regions from each other. Every mechanism here converts an engineering constraint into leverage that never requires defeating Ukraine's military directly. The constraint is the years it takes to rebuild a transformer supply chain and a redundancy buffer that took decades to build up. That leverage is not guaranteed. Resilience measures cost real money and real years of preparation too, and they are already buying part of it back. Hardened, partly buried substations that reportedly saved at least half their equipment in the 2024 strikes. Transformer stockpiles staged forward in Poland and Romania specifically, so a replacement does not have to wait for a new factory slot. An expanded distributed generation, batteries, solar, and small gas turbines that make any single islanded region less dependent on the transmission network. 3 things are worth watching from here more than any single night's headline. Watch whether a substation gets struck more than once in a short window, because that is the tell for deliberate redundancy collapse, not spread-out attrition. Watch transformer and auto-transformer donation numbers, not blackout counts, as the more honest measure of whether Ukraine's resilience is keeping pace with the strikes. Since a stockpiled replacement in a Polish warehouse matters more to next winter than this week's damage report. And watch whether the legal dispute over this campaign eventually resolves in a courtroom neither side currently recognizes as binding on itself. None of this is settled, and a channel built on getting the designation, the range, and the loss count right does not get to pretend otherwise just because a tidy ending reads better. What is settled is the mechanism, a war that increasingly runs on which switchyard gets chosen, not which army wins the next battle for it. The next one in this series goes looking for the machine on the other end of that choice, the interceptor built to stop what gets through.